Guys, so I wanted to do a short video on apologetics and politics because there's been a lot of talk about, let's say, recent converts like misbehaving online, and I tend to usually defend recent converts because I honestly have faith in them. I think they're gonna reinvigorate the church. I think that orthodoxy, even though it is a, let's say, millenarian tradition, every generation has to, let's say, become orthodox. So, um, even though, let's say, being born a cradle is a huge advantage in many ways, at the same time, I'd say that it is no guarantee of anything. So, if you're born a cradle, it doesn't mean that you cannot fall away from the faith. So, um, I do think that cradles bring in a lot of vigor, and that is very important. But with that vigor, also come, let's say, a lot of baggage that comes from, let's say, Western mindset, uh, a lot of, let's say, faulty theology, but also ways of relating to one another, which are, let's say, very liberal. Um, So I wanted to do a little bit of a review on the way we should approach, let's say, political and religious conversations and debates and struggles and fights and the way we should deal with competition mainly. So I'm gonna read to you this that I prepared. So I have two different messages that I think could be edifying. One for young converts eager to defend the faith, another for established apologists, and I think both parties should hear both parts because it's important that we're all on the same page. The reason why I think I'm, let's say, a person to speak on this is because I'm I'm no longer, let's say, a very recent convert, or at least I cannot, in good faith, consider myself one, because honestly, I've had way too many experiences to still, let's say, judge myself with such a low bar. So this is not me actually like trying to take any authority from priests. I'm just a layman. Uh, I also think that a lot of priests are doing a good job, and some of them the opposite. So I hope this doesn't come across as um, somehow me judging others or um, speaking out of place, as if it wasn't my place to speak on these things. I don't mean to condemn anyone in particular. I simply mean to speak on what I believe is the proper way to approach things, um, having in mind that we are part of communities. We're not individuals. Okay, so that's uh, my main perspective. So I'm gonna read to you. It's not wrong to defend the faith or do apologetics. Our church fathers did apologetics and spoke and fought against heresy. They even called for persecution of heresy. However, they did so out of duty to the church as established patriarchs. They weren't slaves. What I mean by they weren't slaves is you have to take into account the position you have within a community. Young men, usually out of ambition, out of pride, out of, let's say, a misguided pursuit of plenitude, of being, let's say, mature, because in many respects they are mature, physically speaking. They want to use orthodox theology as a cudgel to gain uh, power, authority, all those kinds of things that they lack uh, because of economics, because of politics, because of the moral degradation of society. So they end up using the truth in a way that is untrue. Some of them, and this makes them, let's say, hide away on the internet, pretending to be someone they're not, behaving in ways that they wouldn't behave in a parish, and misbehaving in the parishes. So um, I wanted to, let's say, dig deeper on these subjects without condemning anyone in particular, because we've all been guilty of misbehaving. I know that I have, so let's get into it. Young people think that just because they have lived in a chaotic liberal society that they are entitled to speak out against injustice, as if their complaints were equally valid as anyone else's, and this is simply a deformation of our times. What's more, liberalism is a revolutionary and corrupting ideology that has made people think that they can complain their way into having authority and status. This is basically the way that politicians operate, by the way. Liberalism is unstable precisely because it legitimizes revolution as if it were the proper way to conduct ourselves in society, while systematically undermining any kind of society, because it always undermines what brings us together ultimately, in place of their own idols. So there is a way to speak about, let's say, injustice and trying to present uh, true Christianity, if that's what you want to present. But that's the way of the prophets. That's the way of those who are already purified. You need to purify yourself before you start doing those things. And if you're a catechumen, I'm sorry, bro, you cannot be schooling others on Orthodox theology. You need to become Orthodox yourself. And that takes a long, long time. So I don't feel confident in doing these things. And I've been reading about Christianity intensely for the past 10 years and studying about it. Um, I've been Orthodox for what, 4 years now. So uh, I started like getting serious about Orthodoxy around 2016. Um, you know, and I don't feel it's my place to do it. So if you are, um, let's say, a man, which is kind of a stretch of a word, man, to refer to someone 21 years and younger. Um, if you're a man who's just, uh, let's say, found out about orthodoxy, you need to go to a parish. Honestly, you need to like see who you are in relationship with other Orthodox Christians. You cannot simply like um, LARP on the internet. In this vein of what I was referring to before, um, undermining society by bringing out complaints, I believe it's wrong to go out of your way to seek debates as if the spirit of competition was a good thing. If we want to have a positive impact, we should first be pure. We should preach the gospel in our actions and to gain authority to speak before speaking. If someone invites us to debate and it is proper for us to accept, so be it. If we think we can do well in it, then yes, we should take that opportunity to evangelize. But we shouldn't seek debates in order to compete or to spread our message, especially when we haven't established ourselves. Established ourselves, I mean, in terms of authority. Wise elders don't go shouting at the top of their lungs to be heard, and true prophets are first called by God, also willing to get their heads cut off. So they don't do it for worldly gain. They don't do it even to improve, uh, let's say, what they see misguidedly as what people see misguidedly as their community. Um, you have to understand that non-Christians, they're not really part of your community. Not really, honestly. Um, it's kind of a very gray area. God may call us to do just this if things get too out of hand around us. I mean, like engage with heretics, engage with um, pagan idolaters, and things have been getting out of hand. I completely agree with those who want to, let's say, preach the gospel in a more forceful way against the false doctrines of the rest. But that's why we have to be established before we open our mouths. Because honestly, uh, you need to be orthodox before you defend orthodoxy. Humility requires that we wait until it is appropriate for us to speak. I myself, even though I don't think it's fully appropriate for me to speak as if I was any kind of authority, I've waited decades to start making. I've waited a decade and like what, 4 years, like 14 years more or less, before I felt like it was appropriate for me to speak. And I had to ask my spiritual father for um, for his blessing to create stuff. Even then, his blessing wasn't a blessing to do whatever I wanted to do. So, reasoned argument is not inherently sinful. Let's start with that. And correcting others isn't sinful either. But we cannot simply correct anybody just because we are right. Being conceptually correct is meaningless. Proper society is hierarchical. Trying to use formal debates as ways to challenge other people participates in a fundamentally Gnostic, modernist, and liberal way of behaving that undermines hierarchy and which presupposes that people should simply yield their political authority to those who claim to have the best arguments. This is a form of rationalism that wants to enshrine reason as the main, let's say, tool for political organization. It's not a proper way to organize society or to think about human beings. It's a wrong anthropology. Good arguments mean nothing without the performative aspect to justify them. And in that sense, embodied politics comes before disembodied reason. Now, this is something I can speak more about in terms of political philosophy, which is, I would say, my strong suit when it comes to approaching these issues, and the reason why I made the channel in the first place. Doesn't mean that I will not eventually pivot to speaking about other subjects, but that is a subject I feel that I can speak about because of um, what I've read, what I've studied, my focus on university, and um, let's say one of the main driving forces behind my conversion years ago. So, to understand, let's say, the way orthodoxy sees society um, is what solves a lot of the, let's say, philosophically uh, pagan, I'd say, problems uh, that are raised in the history of thought. So eventually, I will make a video about why political philosophy in itself is an impossible uh, an impossible attempt at encapsulating um, all of worldly activity within uh, a more humanistic um, intellectual effort. So we should not only not surrender our goods to random people who walk up to us claiming they know how to employ those resources better, like the ridiculous power hungry technocrats that believe they ought to rule the world, the scientistic kind of guys who are now creating these global institutions to marshal our collective uh, our collective resources into their means, into their ends, into their, let's say on what reality is supposed to be. So we see in that technocratic push, we see a group of specialists, experts, or self-proclaimed experts try to um, appropriate for themselves um, everything in their rationalistic attempt at like controlling all of reality. So we cannot reproduce the same model if we want to escape the system of the beast. So we need to find our own way, not only personally, but also in our communities to express something different. And I believe orthodoxy, properly understood, is exactly that. The church is exactly that. So we must point out this behavior and delegitimize it in our actions, because such practices imply a dialectical understanding of attaining truth through competition. So the world wants to, let's say, pit things together in order to then, like, raise up a winner, right? So that's why argumentation, debates, those kinds of things are seen as part of, let's say, the bedrock of democracy. Free speech, that kind of those kinds of ideas. That is, let's say, liberalism. That is classical liberalism. That is free thinking. Um, Attaining truth through competition. So here we have like a spirit of competition that is driving the West right now, which is nothing but the worship of man and an attempt to use man to deify man, man divinizing himself. This is why liberalism's conception of the rule of law and the social contract is predicated upon negotiation and reasoned argument, when in reality it ends up being more of like power for power's sake, as we currently see in our politics. Because classical liberalism leads to progressivism. Why should we participate in that process as if it were true? By doing the same thing, we would be legitimizing the process by actively trying to compete. Like, and I'm not against competing. I'm against the spirit of competition, which is a different thing, because competing is actually inevitable. Like, you will either have the kingdom of heaven or you will have the system of the beast. Those are two completely incompatible views. So, in the end, in the eschaton, um, one will succeed and the other one will fail. But in the meantime, we have to, let's say, work for us to be able to discern and recognize one system from the other, because if it were possible, even the elect would be deceived. The reason why liberalism will fail is because it needs to either lie or build consensus predicated on lies. The lies can be pointed out and the consensus can be denied. This, I mean, in terms of discourse and debate. A lot of people in the right wing want to be honest liberals without noticing that they're liberals, because they expect others to recognize good argumentation and build consensus based on those argumentations. But truth does not depend on consensus. Truth is not something that bubbles up uh, as we ourselves think about truth, as we, let's say, construct better arguments. That is pagan philosophy, that is Greek philosophy, that is the worship of man. Following those modernist rules of trying to be reasonable and have others concede undermines our authority to speak. We should be speaking uh, from a godly perspective, from a God-given authority, or we should shut up. We would be trying to win at a corrupt game that would completely hamstring us into neurotically trying to obey a simultaneously relativistic and pseudo objective Gnostic worldview. Because in the end, rationalism is um, an impossible and an impossibly proud attempt at reaching truth through man's discursive reason. That is a fundamentally flawed and impossible thing, because man, being finite, cannot simply take his own reason and reason his way into truth. Why should those challenged recognize any challenge as legitimate? I mean, I'm talking about when someone walks walks into your life, let's say, inserts themselves into your life and says, no, you should be doing this because A, B, and C. It's like, first of all, who are you? What is your connection to me? Why should I listen to you in the first place? People usually, out of a misplaced uh, innocence or goodness, they try to deal with other people's arguments when other people present them arguments. But that's a secondary step. That should only happen if you already have a level of trust with the other person. If the other person is not within your community, there is absolutely no reason why you should even indulge in the other person's argument. So I would say, if you're an Orthodox Christian, you have to be mindful of these things and teach these sorts of subtleties to your children. The performative is more important than uh, the the let's say intellectual propositions that people that modern people try to live in. Those propositions are abstractions and presuppose a Gnostic world. So, if challenges in general are legitimate, and I'm not saying that they are inherently, if reasoned argument exists outside of reality and is always legitimate, as free thinking and liberalism imply, then by this very logic, we wouldn't believe in hierarchy in practice. You cannot always be, uh, let's say, challenged on anything. That is the death of authority. By implying performatively that we ought to settle our differences through reasoned argument, the mild mannered reactionaries would be repeating the same liberal problem they wanted to move away from, which is the usurpation of real authority in favor of degeneracy. You see it all the time when the so-called like extreme right wingers are trying to sound reasonable and truly present arguments in good faith, as if they were going to receive good faith in return, as if let's say good faith argumentation were enough or should be enough or had the moral high ground. Good faith argumentation doesn't inherently have the moral high ground, precisely because argumentation is not the be all end all. That is inherently Gnostic. There are moments where you can have like a good reasoned uh, good faith debate, and there are moments where you shouldn't have it. So reasoned argument is a means to avoid the nastier aspects of war, but the underlying political reality should be recognized as war. War should always be on the table, not as a threat to others or as a tool of political conquest, but as a fallen reality we ought to recognize, because the fact that we are incarnate means that there is always that threat of war. Injustice is war, and God won't let it stand. To pretend that all we can do is talk is to pretend that we live in harmony and that our rational discourse can encapsulate everything, meaning we are disembodied and our words and our reason can encapsulate everything. Just this, all of that, which is part of a modernistic free thinking baggage, uh, like tool set that people have used to dominate us politically, just all of this justifies a rationalistic tyranny, because such rule would always be preferable to war within this mindset, guaranteeing that injustice rules, that injustice would be the norm, because war would always be simply too bad to be worth fighting. And this is what the Church of Nice does. It's like, oh, it wouldn't be nice if you actually raised your voice, right? So they transgress, and you're supposed to shut up about it and take it because it wouldn't be correct to say anything. Now, this in this just makes an idol out of peace. Peace is a really important concept, but God gives us peace not as the world gives us peace. God gives us peace in terms of a spiritual peace, in terms of, let's say, being in line with Him, in terms of being in harmony with God. You can be in harmony with God and fight for your people. Those two things are not contradictory. So, We cannot make an idol out of worldly peace. This is simply a recipe for being conquered and subverted. Because if you're not willing to fight for anything, then you will be slowly ground down into nothing. That is the very reason parliaments exist and are so corrupt, to grind you down to nothing, and why individualism is ultimately pushed on society. Liberal political parties exist to perpetuate the system while extracting resources from the people they are meant to represent and destroying their bonds with one another so they cannot talk between each other and organize in a parallel way, and in that sense have institutions that could compete with the state. So the parliaments don't exist to defend liberty. They exist to 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 completely quell it, to completely crush it. We cannot sin towards salvation. We cannot disobey our way into loving God. And this is the fundamental problem in the West. The West wants to keep its fundamental rebellion that it believes to be the core of its identity. But we cannot be both liberal and Christian. We cannot be individualistic and Christian. Christians should not go to war for conquest, but we are allowed to defend ourselves because we can accept the reality of competition while not wanting to compete. We can recognize that somebody is waging a war against us. We cannot seek competition, but we have to act by challenging others to debate, especially if they're not aggressors. We set ourselves as competitors to be elected. We prop ourselves up, our views and our base at the expense of the rest, with the intent of competing with them, um, as what? As a form of cultural warfare. Um, that is not the proper way to go about it. There is a way we can act politically, but um, that is not the Christian way. The proper way is to teach and to let those opportunities to defend ourselves arise naturally. So what we have to do is to pursue virtue and to share that with our people. Then evangelism can be done on a different, let's say, kind of way. But we cannot confuse politics and evangelism. Those need different approaches. While I don't think it's inherently bad to defeat the other or to defeat them completely when we do inevitably clash, and I'm talking both militarily and in a debate, because truth and error cannot coexist, I believe that trying to set up those situations to be singled out is in itself problematic. It's the same as a conqueror who wants to conquer for glory. I know I personally struggle with this, with the vainglory of trying to be better than others. Um, the lack of humility, the pride that comes with needing to be set apart. We do not always have the authority to challenge others because this authority comes from God and from His ministers, and we cannot do it from a spirit of wanting to be elected, even if we think that we're doing it for the purpose of serving God. Our faith did not spread through reasoned argumentation but through living witness. And apologetics can be part of living witness. But by calling people to debate, we assume ourselves to be the champions of orthodoxy, coming to enlighten the world with the sword of Christ. This is especially bad with new converts or even catechumens. It's not an either or, it's not always correct to debate, as it is not always good to avoid debate. Now, if you've established yourself as a person who does debates and you're called to debate, that's a different issue. Why should we believe in debate anyway? That would be my point in regards to, let's say, the limits of debate. If discursive reason truly is below our nous or mind, then why would we give it primacy in our actions instead of prioritizing our mind in all of its noetical splendor? Only an enlightened and purified mind is the one to wield the sword of Christ, not our petty discursive reason. Authority being wielded correctly depends on that personal relationship between our mind and God that is embodied in the church. Personal sanctity is which is what grants authority. Now, I don't mean to reduce discursive reason to something very lowly. I'm simply trying to contrast it because we live in an age that elevates it beyond what's reasonable. Now, reason can show how an argument might be contradictory, but not even the transcendental argument for God, which is as close as we can get, or as we have gotten, to a perfect argument, can make another person believe in the true and living God, because all logic is ultimately circular. So, we need to start from God not just as a premise for our argumentation in a debate, but in our hearts and minds, in the way we act. God needs to be first, and so we cannot rely on discursive reason to perfectly encapsulate our transcendent God. But we must want our brothers to convert, and in our love for them, relinquish our claim to being reasonable. This is different from the political fight. Our political enemies need to be crushed, and that's that. Now, by this, I don't mean like be concerned uh, for other people's conversion in a sense that we need them to convert. That's not actually what I'm talking about. You have to be fine doing an imperfect work because it would be proud to expect that you did a perfect work. That would be, let's say, a continuation of the Western mindset. And you should be fine with the other person, like not buying your argument or not buying, let's say, or not receiving what you're sharing with them as in a proper way. Like, um, because that would recapitulate this problem of needing consensus. The other person is the other person. And if they can't understand it, you cannot fault yourself for that unless it is truly your fault. So it could be that that like Christ came. It could be that you offered the other person Christ perfectly and that the other person didn't recognize Christ. So when it comes to apologetics, we must be reasonable in our unreasonableness. This is what I was talking about before. We must be mad in love with sanity in the sense of wanting the other person to convert to God, to the true faith, but at the same time accepting a level of unreasonableness, a level of irrationality that is part of being human. So it cannot be simply about winning over our brothers, like winning our brother's audience over, or simply crushing them in our argument. Um, you must act with the desire for the other person to convert. So in that sense, you don't need to present like the sharpest arguments. You actually need to, let's say, seek God's inspiration. We must have genuine Christian care for the other person and their salvation. That is the saltiness of our faith. In that sense, I think a lot of rhetoric that we might use during an argument is not truly Christian a lot of the times. If we have to belittle the other person during an argument and all of those things, that can serve a purpose. I'm not saying that insulting another should be completely out of bounds, but we must be very mindful of when we use those tactics. It requires a lot of discernment. If we're talking past the person, treating the other person as if they simply were an avatar for their pagan views, which will happen, and we shouldn't like beat ourselves up too bad about it. Um, if we identify them with their error, that's a real problem. Then we're actually granting them their argument. To identify the other person with their error is to dehumanize them. We might appear to have won the argument in discursive terms, but it's an illusion. In practice, we have lost the argument both in the performative and discursive terms, because when we take the win and try to crown ourselves in our supposed victory, we're performatively saying, um, I mean, when we try to crown ourselves after we have completely destroyed them and completely identified them with their wrong position, yes, you're actually saying, yes, I concede to your point. You truly are the son of the devil that you worship as God, as you rightfully claim within your worldview, and then proceed to gloat over your fallen brother. No, no, no. That is actually a way to, let's say, solidify the other person um, in their error. You have to humiliate the other person, but not existentially. If you completely identify the other person with their mistake, then you haven't let them have any way out of their mistake. So that is not Christian. We have gained the world but lost our brother, like the elder brother in the parable of the prodigal son. We should weep to think this way. When did we start valuing things over people? What right have we when a single soul is more precious to God than the whole lifeless cosmos? When it comes to politics, however, the dynamic is different because politics implies a struggle over a common political body or the cutting off of others from a body. So people confuse both religious apologetics and political debates as if they belong to the same sphere because both have a common denominator, which seems to be the competing speech related to morality and society, etc. And it's all like very intellectual sometimes. But those similarities end when it comes to like the practical aspects, when it comes to rule, for example. Neither one of them is about reason, by the way. But apologetics can appear to remain in the realm of speech without imposing physical conditions on the other, while political competition, by its very nature, will. Apologetics will not necessarily lead someone else to having to submit to the other party directly. Le- at least not necessarily for the winning party's profit. So on the contrary, it should be for God's glory first and foremost, and only secondarily in terms of worldly gain. And a lot of the times it implies worldly loss for the people doing like the preaching. Like look at Saint John the Baptist, like he lost his life, he lost his head, but it's always like a worldly loss in terms of let's say serving God. You lose the world, but you gain the crown of martyrdom. Politics always implies the imposition of a rule and touches on worldly interests, even when there is virtuous and disinterested action, because even virtuous political action will always affect material concerns. So, in that sense, politics is inherently temporal, while, um, let's say, religion is about the transcendent. Those are the two differences, and that's why we need different approaches, because obviously politics is lower than religion. If apologetics should not be understood as being about reasoned argument, politics shouldn't either. Political competition is about rightful authority in regards to secular rule, the temporal, not about speech. Politics is about effective rule of the community and people's participation within a community. It's about authority in a temporal sense. It is practical, severe, and limited to and by the people who participate in it. So it is by its very nature more embodied than apologetics, which starts from the premise of dealing with people who have a different tradition. So here we also have to distinguish between, let's say, domestic politics and foreign politics. But when I wrote this, I was thinking more about domestic politics in the sense of the way a community is ruled from inside, right? While if you take that view of, let's say, concentrating on politics as a fundamentally domestic affair, where, well, where rather politics, where internal politics is more important than, let's say, foreign affairs, uh, because that should be the orientation of any political society, to look inwards rather than to look outwards. Um, then you have also another contrast, which is that apologetics deals with someone who is different, of a different faith, right? While politics is about, let's say, trying to solve a problem that is for a particular community. So politics can try to claim to rule people's hearts by threatening to expel those who don't abide by a moral rule. Um, but such a claim can also avoid overstepping into the religious sphere if what it asks of people is moral. So, a good political ruler can and should work in symphony with the religious authorities. So, in that sense, politics cannot be completely subsumed within religion, but politics and religion can work together, and that is what makes, let's say, the political um, serve the transcendent. We Westerners live in liberal societies that have granted almost every liberty except the authority to curtail other people's freedom. That is because we have been robbed of our personal authority, of our institutional authority as well, by a state that has usurped the authority of the institutions that make it up in order to reduce people to a number and flatten those social institutions. So now only the state and the let's say individual, the atomized individual, are, let's say, the only actors, right? So this way you reduce people to a number, and you can and they're easier to control actually. Like simply raise taxes, lower taxes. Like it's it's easier for the technocrats to marshal the state if there are no, let's say, competing authorities. It's easier to slowly tax a degenerate individualistic population to death than it is to deal with people who live within modern institutions like families and churches, whose authority rivals that of the state. So, in reality, the liberalism that runs rampant is a means to enslave us all to the state. By leveling the proper authorities, the system can then deal with atomized individuals that can be coerced more easily through technology. Instead of having to explain to you and your people why I am acting this way, I can simply switch off your node and say, oh no, but he was anti science, right? And now you no longer have money. And you could never have other people willing to risk themselves being switched off for you because they don't share like enough in common with you. Why would they risk going against the experts if you have nothing that really separates you from those experts in their humanistic ideals? So instead of being a part of a harmonious community, you're then enslaved by your passions because that's what the system needs to, let's say, prop itself up, yours and other people's. Because when your power, let's say, ceases, um, another person's power, another group of people's power, like will take over. So you're free until your weakness creeps in and other people's strength uh, come in. So it's a system of pure power, actually. The family and the church and their authorities have been undermined in an effort to impose an individualistic perspective that leads to competing for pure power, and where pure power is then the only thing that can possibly rule and organize tribes, since this power exists for the sole reason of denying the idea there is such a thing as one truth. Christianity is incompatible with that liberal perspective, which is ultimately pure power. Might makes right, as well as being incompatible with rationalism, which is ultimately the same thing. We should be very careful not to fall into rationalism ourselves, giving everything over to human reason, which is nothing other than an idolatry of pure power. Power will not save us by itself. Only the cross will save us. So let us stand fast, brothers, and accept the cross, while we also defend those who share our faith the best we can. So, if you have any thoughts, I'd be happy to. I'd be happy to hear. See ya.